I was sitting on my porch with a cup of tea when a truck the size of a small building rolled up my driveway and two strangers knocked on my door asking where I wanted my furniture loaded. That is how I found out my house of 58 years no longer belonged to me. Not a phone call. Not a letter. Not even a warning. Just two men with clipboards standing on the porch my husband built with his own hands, telling me the new owners would be arriving that afternoon. I want to tell you everything that happened before that moment, because I think if you are caring for an aging parent, or if you are getting older yourself like I am, you need to hear this story all the way through. Kindly subscribe to Chronicles of Time. My name does not matter for this story, but my age does. I am 90 years old. I raised two children in that house, buried my husband from the living room window seat where he liked to watch the birds, and spent 3 decades teaching 3rd grade at the elementary school down the road. When my husband passed 12 years ago, I decided to stay in the house rather than move into a smaller place or an assisted living community. My children lived out of state, busy with their own families, and visits became phone calls, and phone calls slowly became less frequent as the years went on. I did not blame them. Life moves fast for the young, even when it feels like it has slowed to a crawl for someone my age. The person who stepped in to fill that gap was my nephew, the son of my late sister. He lived only 20 minutes away, and after his mother passed he started checking in on me more often. At first it was small things. He would mow the lawn when it got too long for me to manage. He would drive me to doctor's appointments when my hip made it difficult to get in and out of the car on my own. He brought groceries some weeks, and he always seemed to have time for me in a way my own children, through no real fault of their own, simply did not. I was grateful. I told my friends at church how lucky I was to have a nephew like that looking out for an old woman living alone. Looking back now, I understand that gratitude can be a door left open, and some people know exactly how to walk through it. He started asking questions that seemed reasonable at the time. Did I have my important papers organized? Did I know where my deed was kept? Had I thought about what would happen to the house if something happened to me suddenly? These are not unusual questions for a caring relative to ask an elderly person living alone, and that is precisely what made them so easy to trust. He offered to help me organize my filing cabinet one afternoon, and I let him, because my eyes were not what they used to be and reading small print for hours at a time gave me headaches. It was during that afternoon of organizing papers that I now believe he found what he needed. I did not think much of it then. He asked me to sign a few forms he said were related to updating my emergency contact information with the county and making sure my paperwork was current in case anything happened to me. I trusted him completely. I had known this young man since he was in diapers. I had watched him grow into what I believed was a responsible, caring adult. I signed where he pointed, the way you do when you trust someone, without reading every line, because you believe the person handing you the pen has your best interests at heart. Weeks passed and life continued as normal. He still mowed my lawn. He still called to check on me. If anything, he seemed more attentive than before, which in hindsight I now recognize as a pattern rather than a coincidence. He would ask me how I was feeling, whether I had been eating well, whether the house felt too big and lonely for me some days. I remember telling him once that some mornings I did wonder if I would be happier somewhere smaller, somewhere with less upkeep and less silence. I said it the way anyone says a passing thought out loud to a person they trust. I did not know that thought would later be used against me as proof that I wanted to sell. The first sign that something was wrong came from my neighbor, a woman I had known for over 20 years, who mentioned that a real estate agent had stopped by her house asking questions about the neighborhood and property values. I thought nothing of it at first. Real estate agents canvass neighborhoods all the time, especially in an area like mine where homes rarely come up for sale and buyers are eager. It was not until she mentioned the agent specifically asked about my house, using my address, that a small knot formed in my stomach. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself there had to be a simple explanation. I decided to go to the bank the following week to check on some certificates of deposit that were coming due, something I did every few months out of habit more than necessity. It was during that visit, while the teller was pulling up my account information, that she paused, looked at her screen, and asked me gently if I was aware that a large wire transfer had been processed from an account linked to the sale of a property. I remember the exact moment my body went cold. I asked her what property. She turned the monitor toward me, and there it was, my address, listed as a completed sale, with a signature at the bottom of the document that was supposed to be mine. I stared at that signature for what felt like an eternity. It looked close to my handwriting, close enough to fool a bank teller processing dozens of documents a day, but it was not mine. I know my own signature. I have signed my name for 90 years. The loops were wrong. The pressure was wrong. It was the signature of someone trying to be me, not the signature of me. I asked the teller to print everything she could for me, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the paper. I did not cry in that bank, though I wanted to. I have learned in 90 years that there is a time to fall apart and a time to stay steady, and I knew instinctively this was a moment to stay steady. I want to pause the story here for a moment, because I think this next part matters as much as anything else I am going to tell you. When I got home that day, I sat at my kitchen table for nearly 2 hours before I made a single phone call. I was not just angry. I was trying to understand how something like this could happen to a person who reads the newspaper every morning, who balances her own checkbook, who taught children how to read for 30 years. I want anyone listening who thinks this could never happen to them or to someone they love to understand that fraud like this does not target foolish people. It targets trusting people, and trust is not a flaw. It is something that is exploited precisely because it is good. The first call I made was to my daughter, who lived 4 states away. I remember my voice cracking for the first time that day when I told her what I had found at the bank. She was on a flight within 18 hours. The second call I made was to a lawyer a friend from church had used years earlier for an unrelated matter. I did not know at the time that elder financial exploitation cases like mine are disturbingly common. I later learned that forged signatures on deeds and financial documents are one of the most frequently reported forms of elder financial abuse, and that the overwhelming majority of cases involve someone the older adult already knows and trusts, often a family member rather than a stranger. When my daughter arrived, we went through every document together. The forged deed transfer had used the very same forms I had signed that afternoon. My nephew helped me organize my filing cabinet, the ones he told me were for updating my emergency information. He had apparently layered additional paperwork underneath, or substituted pages after I signed, though the exact method was something the investigators would later need to determine. What mattered in that moment was the outcome. My house, the one my husband and I bought when we were younger than my grandchildren are now, had been listed, sold, and the funds had already been wired out before I had any idea it was happening. The buyers, it turned out, were innocent parties who had gone through what looked like a completely normal real estate transaction, with a title company, an agent, and paperwork that appeared legitimate on its face. This detail mattered enormously going forward, because it meant the people standing on my porch with moving trucks were not villains in this story. They were victims of the same deception I was, just from a different angle. That realization actually helped me, strangely, because it meant my anger had a clear and singular direction, rather than spreading out toward people who had done nothing wrong. My lawyer moved quickly once we brought her the paperwork from the bank. She explained that because the signature had been forged rather than obtained through coercion or a legitimate but manipulated agreement, we had a strong path forward, though she was honest with me that these cases can take months, sometimes longer, to fully resolve. She filed to have the transfer voided and contacted the title insurance company involved in the sale, since title insurance exists specifically to protect against exactly this kind of fraudulent transfer. She also advised me to file a report with local law enforcement and with the state agency responsible for investigating elder abuse and exploitation, which I did within the same week. The conversation with my nephew, when it finally happened, is not one I enjoy remembering. I asked him to come to the house, and my daughter sat beside me at the same kitchen table where I had once trusted him to help organize my papers. I asked him directly if he knew anything about the sale of my home. I watched his face for a long moment before he answered, and in that pause I already knew the truth, the way you sometimes know a storm is coming before the first drop of rain falls. He eventually admitted that he had needed money for debts he had not told anyone about, and that he had convinced himself he was not really stealing from me, because he told himself he would explain everything to me eventually and would pay me back once he was financially stable again. I want to be honest about something here, because I think honesty is the only thing worth offering at 90 years old. Part of me wanted to understand him. Part of me wanted to find a version of this story where he was simply desperate rather than deceptive, where this was a mistake rather than a plan. But a plan requires forged documents, a coordinated sale, a wire transfer, and weeks of pretending nothing was wrong while mowing my lawn and asking how I was feeling. Desperation does not require months of careful deception. What happened to me was not an accident born of panic. It was calculated, and accepting that truth, as painful as it was, allowed me to finally stop making excuses for someone I had loved since he was a small boy running through my backyard. The legal process that followed took nearly 8 months from start to finish. The title insurance company, once presented with evidence of the forgery, worked with authorities to unwind the fraudulent sale, and I was able to remain in my home throughout the process rather than being displaced, which I am told is not always the outcome in cases like this and which I remain deeply grateful for. My nephew faced legal consequences for what he did, consequences that were determined by the courts rather than by me, because by that point I had made peace with letting the justice system handle what I no longer had the strength to carry alone. My relationship with him, as you might imagine, has not been repaired, though I have chosen not to carry hatred in my heart for him, because at 90 years old I have decided hatred takes up space I would rather use for something else. In the months while the case moved through the system, my daughter made the decision to stay with me rather than return home right away, and I will admit that having her in the house again, sleeping in her old childhood bedroom, brought back a kind of comfort I had not felt since my husband was alive. We spent evenings going through old photo albums together, and more than once she told me she wished she had visited more often over the years, not because of what happened, but because she realized how much of my daily life she had missed simply by living far away and assuming I was managing fine on my own. I told her there was nothing to forgive, that distance is simply a fact of modern families, but I understood the guilt behind her words because I had felt something similar myself, wondering what I could have noticed sooner if I had only been paying closer attention. Word of what happened spread through my small community faster than I expected, the way news always does in a place where people have known each other for decades. I worried, at first, about the judgment I might face, about neighbors whispering that a foolish old woman had been careless with her own home. Instead, what I received was an outpouring of support I did not anticipate. Women from my church began stopping by with casseroles and simply sitting with me for an hour so I would not be alone with my thoughts. A retired police officer who lived 2 streets over offered, without being asked, to walk me through basic steps for protecting my finances going forward, things like freezing my credit and setting up alerts on every account I owned. I learned that community, even in the aftermath of betrayal by family, can still show up in ways that restore your faith in people rather than diminish it further. There were nights during those 8 months when the fear crept back in, usually late at night when the house was quiet and my mind had nothing to distract it. I would lie awake wondering whether the movers would return, whether some paperwork error would leave me without a home despite everything my lawyer had explained to me about the strength of our case. My daughter would often find me at the kitchen table at 2 or 3 in the morning, and rather than tell me to go back to sleep, she would simply sit with me until the worst of the fear passed. I share this because I think it is important for people to understand that even when the legal outcome is favorable, the emotional weight of discovering that someone you love deceived you does not disappear the moment a judge signs a document. Healing happens on its own timeline, slower than paperwork, and gentler with itself than most of us are willing to be. If there is one thing I want you to take from my story, it is this. Protecting an older adult from financial exploitation is not about assuming every family member is a threat. It is about building simple habits of transparency long before anything ever goes wrong. Keep copies of important documents in more than one place, and consider letting a trusted second person, ideally someone outside the household, review any paperwork before signing. Set up account alerts at your bank for any large transactions, and do not be afraid to ask questions or slow down before signing something presented to you as routine, even by someone you love and trust completely. If something feels slightly off, even if you cannot explain why, trust that feeling enough to pause and verify before you proceed. Adult protective services exist in every state specifically for situations like mine, and reaching out to them is not a betrayal of family, it is a form of self-protection that far too many older adults hesitate to use out of fear or shame they should never have to carry. I am telling this story not for sympathy, but because I believe stories like mine are more common than most people realize, and silence is exactly what allows them to keep happening. If this story moved you in any way, I would be so grateful if you considered subscribing to this channel, where we share real stories of people who found strength in the middle of very difficult circumstances. Thank you for sitting with me through this story today, and whatever chapter of life you are in, I wish you safety, clear eyes, and people around you worthy of the trust you give them. Take care of yourselves, and take care of each other.